Thank you all. Can you hear me? Thank you all for coming. Thank you for being here. Some of you for coming a great distance. It's a pleasure to be in Detroit, the capital of Arab America, the place where I think it's the largest concentration of Arab Americans in the United States. It's fitting that I should start. I'm giving 3 talks here at Ann Arbor, and I'll be there's something at University of Michigan Dearborn, I'm not sure what, on Friday. It's fitting that I should be here at Wayne State in the heart of Detroit, and that I be talking about this topic here, because it's a topic that concerns us all as people who have an interest in many cases, a very close connection to the Middle East, and for some of us, a very close connection to Palestine. This is not going to be a happy talk. No? I'm talking about American policy in the Middle East. And unless you enjoy hearing stories of war and misery and dispossession, it's a story that doesn't have a happy ending. As we all know, for the past few months, the Obama administration, spearheaded by Secretary of State John Kerry, has been engaged in renewed negotiations between the PLO and Israel. These talks have been taking place amongst very low expectations of success. When people are asked why they don't think these talks are going to succeed, three reasons are usually given. The first is the imminence of our midterm elections in November, just over 7 months from now. As everybody knows, when there are elections on, it's almost impossible for anyone in Washington to focus much attention on a complicated problem like the Middle East. So that's the first reason. Second reason is the well-known feebleness of the PLO and of the Palestinian Authority, headed by Mahmoud Abbas. This is an authority which has little Palestinian popular support for its chosen approach of negotiating with Israel from a position of Palestinian weakness and internal division. So that's the second reason why people are not optimistic about this latest round of negotiations. The third, however, is I think the most serious reason. And this is the uncompromising stand of the Netanyahu government on every single substantive issue between the two parties, whether it's Jerusalem, whether it's the unceasing expansion of Israeli settlements, whether it's the border issue, whether it's the question of full sovereignty, whether it's the question of ending occupation, whether it's the question of water rights, whether it's the question of refugees. On all of these, this is probably the most uncompromising Israeli government in many, many years. Now, I think everybody agrees that these are daunting obstacles. But I would argue, and this is what I'm going to be talking about this evening, that there are deeper reasons to look skeptically at the latest round of negotiations conducted by Secretary Kerry. To see why I make this argument, I am going to examine some of the structural reasons why the United States, which has been engaged in this process, depending on how you count it, for 22 years since the Madrid Peace Conference, or 35 going on 36 years since Camp David, why the United States has not succeeded in bringing about a settlement between Israel and the Palestinians. As you know, the Camp David Accords of 1978 were meant to resolve this issue. As you know, one of the major issues that the Madrid Peace Conference and subsequent negotiations dealt with and were supposed to resolve was this issue. They haven't succeeded. So let me take us back a little ways. And from there, I think I can explain what the structural reasons for this constant, unceasing failure of quite significant American efforts has been. Back in October 1991, in preparation for the Madrid Peace Conference, Secretary of State James Baker sent what were called letters of assurances to all the parties. Israel got letter of assurances, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon. The Palestinians got one. In the letter to the Palestinians, Baker promised that the United States would oppose actions that were described as, quote, prejudicial, in other words, that would prejudice, or precedential, that would create precedents, for negotiations. The United States committed itself to oppose actions that were prejudicial or precedential to negotiations, that established precedents. One such action, explicitly mentioned in Baker's letter of assurance to the Palestinians, was the expansion of Israeli settlements. That was then, that is now, a core issue in this dispute. As you may have noticed, the United States did not keep this promise to oppose settlement expansion. And in the decades since 1991, it has done, as far as I can tell, absolutely nothing to stop the ceaseless Israeli colonization of the West Bank and of occupied Arab East Jerusalem. This was, in fact, only one of several unfulfilled American commitments that were made to the Palestinians in that letter of October 1991, which also promised that, and here I'm quoting the letter, that the United States will act as an honest broker, unquote. Similarly, going 17 years a little later than Madrid, during a subsequent phase of U.S. brokered negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians, Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice in 2008 used the same language as Baker. Speaking to a Palestinian delegation, she stressed that the United States had a role, quote, had a role as an honest broker. So this same language recurs in the rhetoric of American secretaries of state decade after decade after decade. In fact, we're hearing this language for the third consecutive decade. I argue in this book, Brokers of Deceit, that Baker's language in the letter of assurances in 1991, Condoleezza Rice's language, Secretary Rice's language in 2008, were both reiterations of a central myth about this conflict. This is that the United States serves as a disinterested intermediary between Israel and the Palestinians. What I show in the book, this is not entirely a surprise, by the way, but what I show in the book is that for many decades, the United States has behaved in a thoroughly one-sided way. It has not been an honest broker. In consequence, far from resolving the conflict, this is not just a failure to resolve the conflict. This has entailed an exacerbation and a prolongation of the conflict. The United States hasn't failed to solve the conflict. The United States has made the conflict considerably worse. And I'll go into some of the ways in which that is the case. Now, there's another myth. There are many myths about this conflict. But according to another myth, this is a conflict between two victimized peoples, peoples which are near equals, peoples which have rights that are in conflict, and it's not a conflict between a strong victimizer and a weaker victim. This is, in fact, a false presentation of the situation. In reality, this is a highly asymmetrical conflict. There's no parity in it. This is a conflict between a powerful Israeli state, which is strongly supported by this country, the greatest power in world history, and the power that has been the greatest power in world history since World War II, and between a Palestinian people that Israel has fully dominated for over 65 years. This people, the Palestinians, have never in their entire modern history enjoyed self-determination, and for a century the Palestinians have lived under various forms of imposed alien rule or have lived dispersed in exile from their homeland. Clearly, there's no symmetry here. This is not a symmetrical conflict. These are not two equal parties. Now, language has had a great importance in the construction of these and many, many other myths. I quote in the book, in fact, as the epigraph to the introduction, I quote George Orwell, who in an essay entitled Politics in the English Language wrote in 1946 that, and here I'm quoting Orwell, the slovenliness, the sloppiness in other words, the slovenliness of our language makes it easier for us to have foolish thoughts. If thought corrupts language, language can also corrupt thought. This is exactly what is happening here. The way in which people think about this conflict is corrupted by dishonest terms like honest broker or peace process. These terms have corrupted thought and they have masked a reality, and that reality is the complicity of a whole series of American administrations in the continued dominance of the Israeli state over the Palestinians. It's also, this language has also concealed how closely the policies of the United States towards this question have been entwined with that of Israel, to the point that their views on many issues are virtually identical. Now, one of the things I did not know and only really learned in doing research for this book was that there is a point where this complicity, really, this identity of views, actually begins. And that was, I think, a secret letter sent in 1975 from President Ford to Prime Minister Rabin. It's not secret anymore. It's on the website of the Israeli Foreign Ministry. But it was never mentioned by Secretary Kissinger in his 3 volumes of memoirs, and it wasn't released with the documents that were released at one time in the Foreign Relations of the United States series. So it was kept secret for a very long time. By the terms of this letter from President Ford to Prime Minister Rabin, the United States agreed, and here I quote the letter, to coordinate with Israel with a view to refraining from putting forth proposals that Israel would consider unsatisfactory. The United States is promising that it would, and I'm quoting, coordinate with Israel with a view to refraining from putting forth proposals that Israel would consider unsatisfactory. In other words, the United States, the greatest power in world history, committed itself to refraining from putting forward any language on the Palestine issue which did not have the prior approval of the Israeli government. Israel got, from President Ford, veto power over anything the United States would put forward on this issue by the terms of this letter. Given what amounts to a self-imposed, by the United States, self-imposed unity of views between the United States and Israel on this issue, I would argue it has been impossible for the United States to play the role of impartial intermediary between these two sides. Moreover, if you think about it for 2 seconds, you realize that this prior coordination of positions with Israel helps to explain why the United States for decades has failed to make any progress towards resolving this conflict. Now, let me take us up to the present, because there have been much more recent examples of the complicity between these two countries, between the United States and Israel. The two most recent ones, or the most recent ones, have been the almost exclusive focus of Secretary Kerry's recent efforts, really over the last several months. This is pretty much all he's focused on, is 2 items. One has been a brand new demand that the Israeli government came up with for the recognition of Israel as a Jewish state, and much more importantly, a almost exclusive focus on the question of security, as this term is expansively defined by Israel. That is pretty much all they got into. They dealt a little bit with some other issues, but they made almost no progress on them. The Secretary of State brought 150 experts under General Allen to deal with Israeli security concerns. And that is most of what has happened over the past 7 or 8 months of this negotiation. Security has been the focus. In practice, this concentration on security has been embodied in an Israeli insistence reported amply in the press in the last few weeks, which appears to have been accepted by the United States, on the continuation for an indefinite period, some reports say 10 years, some reports say more, of Israeli military control of the entire Jordan River Valley region. Now, if you think a little bit about the fact that the Jordan River is what separates the West Bank from the rest of the world, and it is what enables Israel to maintain complete control over that region, this translates into the indefinite continuation of Israel's occupation of the entirety of the West Bank and occupied Arab East Jerusalem. This completely rules out, for the foreseeable future at least, any prospect of Palestinian statehood, of sovereignty, or of self-determination for the Palestinians.